Judas Iscariot. His name is synonymous with betrayal, marked by one of the most well-known acts in history. But who was this man before he was known as a betrayer of Jesus? What led him to make such a devastating decision, even though he walked side by side with the Messiah himself? This story, filled with mystery, ambition, and regret, invites us to look beyond the label he received. Let's delve into the details of Judas' life, from his calling to his tragic end, to discover not only who he was, but also the profound lessons his story offers us. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Judas Iscariot, a name that in itself already carries mystery and concern. Little is known about his early years, but what is known is enough to begin to weave the story of a man who would be part of the most impactful events in the history of humanity. His surname, Iscariot, seems to hold clues. Some say it means man of Sherioth, a small village in Judea, which would make him the only disciple not from Galilee. Others suggest that it may have some connection with the term Sicario, referring to a group of armed revolutionaries. But who, after all, was this young man before being called by Jesus? What made him stand out among so many others to be chosen as one of the 12 apostles? Judas, like anyone else, carried dreams, hopes, and also his own struggles. Life at that time was hard. Many Jews lived under the weight of Roman oppression, and the expectation of a Messiah who would come to free the people was alive in everyone's hearts. So, amid the scenario of hopes and frustrations, Judas is called. And it wasn't just any calling. Jesus personally chose him to walk alongside him, to witness miracles, learn the teachings, and perhaps be part of the promise of a new kingdom. This moment must have been overwhelming for Judas. Perhaps he felt the weight of responsibility, or, who knows, saw the opportunity to achieve something greater. Jesus' call reached Judas like lightning in the middle of a dark night, an unexpected invitation that, from one moment to the next, changed the course of his life. He, an ordinary man with his daily worries and a heart full of concerns, was chosen to walk side by side with the one who many already believed to be the promised Messiah. At first, it was overwhelming. The opportunity to be close to the man who performed miracles, who spoke about a kingdom of peace and justice, was a unique chance. Judas may have felt a mixture of wonder and expectation. Could he finally stand before the one who would bring Israel's liberation? After all, many hoped for a leader who would rise up against Roman rule, someone who would restore power to the Jewish people. But Judas wasn't the only one with expectations. Each of the disciples had their own views of the follow Jesus represented. Some saw spiritual hope, others longed for political liberation. And Judas, in this group, was no different. Perhaps, deep down, he believed that this calling would lead him to something greater than he could even imagine. As he followed Jesus, Judas began to witness things few could imagine. Miracles happened before his eyes, and the Master's words were profound, full of mysteries and promises. However, as the days passed, something about Judas didn't seem to completely align with the others. As the days turned into months, Judas walked alongside Jesus and the other apostles, watching, listening, learning. The coexistence with the Master was intense. Every word spoken by Jesus, every miracle performed, left everyone amazed and full of hope. They saw paralyzed people walking, blind people seeing, and people being freed from their torments. It was impossible not to feel impacted. With each step, the disciples' faith grew, and Judas, in a way, was there, in the middle of it all, witnessing the power of God. But while the others seemed to give themselves completely to Jesus' call, something about Judas sounded different. Maybe he was confused, maybe he was frustrated. He saw the Master accomplish so many great things. But what about the kingdom that everyone expected? Where was the promised deliverance? The Romans still dominated. The suffering of the people continued. Was Judas beginning to question the ways of Jesus? It was as if, little by little, he distanced himself internally from what was happening. Despite being there, following everything, Judas seemed to carry a shadow within him, a restlessness that would not go away. Jesus spoke of a kingdom that was not of this world, and this was perhaps not what Judas expected. The desire for something more concrete, more earthly, grew in his heart. He was not someone easy to figure out, and often his silence revealed more than his words. And it was in this context that Judas received an important responsibility. He was tasked with taking care of the group's finances. The choice of Judas as responsible for the group's finances could have been seen as a sign of trust. After all, taking care of money required discipline, attention, and responsibility. Every donation that arrived to help the poor or to support the group passed through the hands of Judas. He had control of the purse that held what was destined for those in need. This role, at first, seemed like just a practical task, but little by little, the weight of that money began to be felt in a different way. It was a delicate position. He didn't just deal in coins. It dealt with people's hopes, with the sustenance of those who depended on Jesus and his followers. However, something happened in the heart of Judas when he had this role. He began to worry. The shine of the coins, the metallic sound they made as they fell into the bag, seemed to gain greater weight within him. A small temptation began to grow, silent, imperceptible, but constant. Over time, Judas began to embezzle some of the money. He took small amounts for himself, believing no one would notice. And maybe they didn't realize it for a long time. But Jesus knew the hearts of all his followers. What was going on in Judas' mind was not a secret to the Master. However, nothing was said directly. It was as if Jesus' very presence was always foreshadowing what was to come. It was on a quiet afternoon in a simple house in Bethany that something changed between Judas and the others. Jesus was there with his disciples, and Mary, sister of Lazarus, entered the room with a bottle of pure, very expensive perfume made from nard. Without saying a word, she knelt at Jesus' feet and poured the perfume over him, filling the air with a sweet, enveloping aroma. Everyone remained silent, observing the gesture of devotion. It was a demonstration of love and honor, a unique moment. But in the midst of this scene, Judas could not hide his dissatisfaction. For him, that was a waste. His face hardened, and he broke the silence. Why wasn't this perfume sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor? The words echoed throughout the room, surprising the other disciples. It didn't seem like sincere concern, but rather disguised criticism. Perhaps, at that moment, Judas was just trying to justify his own greed. Jesus, however, did not let himself be shaken. He knew Mary's heart, and he knew what was going on in Judas' heart. Calmly, the Master replied, "Leave her alone. She did this for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." Jesus' words were a clear defense of Mary's act. Judas was silent, but something in him had changed profoundly. From that moment in Bethany, something dark began to take over Judas. Perhaps it was frustration, greed, or who knows, growing disenchantment with the words of Jesus, who spoke of a kingdom that did not seem to materialize in the way he expected. Judas longed for something more tangible, something his eyes could see and his hands could hold. And in the midst of this restlessness, a greater force began to involve him. The scriptures say that Satan entered Judas. It was not a sudden event, but like a shadow that, little by little, covered his heart. He was no longer just fighting his own doubts and desires. Now, he became a pawn in a much greater plan, a plan of darkness and betrayal. Judas may have believed he was still in control of his actions, but in reality his path was leading towards something he could never have imagined. It was as if every decision he made pushed him deeper into an abyss he couldn't escape. And in the silence of his thoughts, the voices that tormented him became louder and louder. What did he expect from Jesus? A political leader? A liberator of the people of Israel? Increasingly, Judas realized that what Jesus was offering was something he was not willing to accept. And so, guided by this invisible force, He began to plan what would be the greatest act of betrayal in history, with his mind filled with darkness. Judas knew exactly what he needed to do. He went looking for the religious leaders, those who were always on the lookout, looking for a way to capture Jesus without causing an uproar among the people. Judas knew the paths, the dark alleys where conversations took place in secret, away from the watchful eyes of the crowd. And it was there in the shadow of these meetings that he offered what the priests wanted most, a way to arrest Jesus without anyone noticing. The price was discussed, and 30 pieces of silver was the agreed upon amount. 30, enough to buy a field or pay for a slave. Judas, who previously had in his hands the money intended to help those in need, now accepted this sum to betray the one he had followed for so long. The religious leaders were pleased. Finally, they had in their hands the key to arrest Jesus, and Judas himself would be the guide for this. The match was made. He knew exactly where and when Jesus would be, in a secluded place, away from the crowds. Everything was armed. Judas, now, just waited for the right moment. But deep down, even with the coins in his possession, an uneasiness seemed to grow within him. And this uneasiness would only increase as the Last Supper approached, where Judas would sit at the table with Jesus and the others, knowing what he had plotted. The room was silent except for the soft sound of the disciples gathered around the table. It was the Last Supper, although few there knew it. Jesus, in the center, looked at them with impressive calm, as if he were at peace, even though he knew what was about to happen. Judas, in turn, was there too, with the 30 coins still weighing on his mind, although no one besides him, and Jesus knew what he had plotted. He ate, drank, looked at others, but his heart was distant, tormented by the shadow of betrayal he carried. It was then that, in the middle of dinner, Jesus made a statement that chilled everyone's blood. "One of you is going to betray me." The words resonated past through the room like thunder, and the silence that followed was suffocating. The disciples looked at each other, confused and incredulous. One by one, they began to ask, "Is it me, Lord?" Doubt and fear hovered over the table. Each of them, with their own imperfections, feared being the one to betray the Master. Judas, in an act that mixed despair and coldness, also addressed Jesus. "Will it be me, Master?" It was as if he was trying to hide his guilt behind his words, as if he wanted to test what Jesus really knew. But Jesus looked at it all. Without raising his voice, without fuss, he responded enigmatically, "You said it." The weight of those words fell on Judas like a stone. What would follow was no longer a distant possibility. Now, betrayal was on the verge of happening. And while the other disciples were still trying to understand what Jesus had said, Judas was already preparing to take the next step. The night progressed, and Judas' plan finally took shape. Jesus and the disciples went to the Garden of Gethsemane, a place of prayer and silence. Judas knew that this would be the perfect moment. Away from the crowds, under the dim starlight, he led the guards to Jesus. The air was heavy, and the smell of the olive trees mingled with the muffled sound of cautious footsteps approaching. Judas led the group of soldiers and religious leaders, his hands holding the 30 coins inside his bag as if trying to convince himself that it was necessary. He was at the front, a traitor in the shadows, preparing to hand over his master with a gesture that, until then, meant affection and respect. A kiss. When he arrived in the garden, he saw Jesus, calm as ever, waiting. His tired companions barely knew what was about to happen. Judas, with his heart racing, approached and, without hesitation, carried out what he had agreed with the guards. With an expression that mixed guilt and false serenity, he leaned towards Jesus and, as he had promised, kissed him. The silence of the garden was broken by the sound of soldiers advancing. Judas' kiss sealed Jesus' fate, but also his own. Jesus, however, did not react with anger. He just looked at Judas, and his words echoed like a last call. "Friend, why have you come?" Judas, already trapped in his own choices, did not respond. The regret had not yet fully manifested itself. But that question would remain engraved in his soul. The soldiers arrested Jesus, and chaos spread among the disciples. As everyone fled, the betrayal was complete, but for Judas, something even darker awaited him. When Judas saw Jesus being taken away by the soldiers, the weight of his actions began to be crushingly revealed. What he had done no longer seemed part of a plan, but part of a tragedy that he now could not control. The 30 silver coins that once had some value suddenly became an unbearable burden, each one of them seeming to weigh more than his own soul. With every step he took, regret began to crawl inside him like a snake. He no longer saw religious leaders as allies. Those men who had promised safety and protection to Judas no longer had any interest in him. The focus now was only on Jesus, and Judas was nothing more than a discarded piece in a much bigger game. Desperate and confused, he decided to return. He needed to undo what he had done, needed to give the coins back, as if that could erase what had already been done. Upon arriving before the priests, Judas threw the coins on the ground, his voice choked with guilt and despair. "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But coldly, they simply replied, "What do we care? That's up to you." There was no redemption in that place. Judas was alone, and the weight of his act seemed to crush him more and more. The coins scattered across the floor reflected the dim light of the temple, but the brightness that had once fascinated Judas was now unbearable. He fled from there, running through the darkness of the city, his heart heavy and his mind collapsing. Guilt was building inside him, like a storm about to explode. And that night, with no more hope, Judas made the decision that would lead to his end. Night fell heavily on Judas. Regret was no longer a distant shadow, but a monster that consumed him from within. He ran aimlessly, running away from something that was closer than he could bear, his own conscience. The sound of the coins he had thrown into the temple still echoed in his mind, and with it, the memory of Jesus' look. A look that, unlike the others, did not bring condemnation, but deep sadness. That look haunted him. Judas did not find peace. Nowhere seemed safe, and his soul writhed in agony. He was lost, caught between remorse and hopelessness. The betrayal had been consummated, and now there was no going back. What was left for him? The priest did not listen to him. The disciples were scattered, and the people. Oh, the people. He knew he would never be able to face anyone again. It was then that, in an act of desperation, Judas took the rope he was carrying with him. In a lonely field, far from anyone's eyes, he prepared what would be his end. The wind blew softly, as if the world itself regretted the tragic fate of that man who, through greed or illusion, had betrayed the Son of God. Judas tied the rope, and at that moment, all of life's mistakes and regrets suffocated him at once. The field where he chose to end his life soon became known as the Field of Blood. The coins he had thrown were used to buy that piece of land, staying with the price of betrayal. But the story of Judas, despite ending there, would still be remembered for generations. Over time, Judas Iscariot became a central figure in debates, sermons, and reflections. Who was he, anyway? A traitor driven by greed, or someone who, taken by greater forces, lost control of his destiny? Some see in Judas the figure of repentance that was never fully lived, while others see in him a warning to those who place their own desires above the divine purpose. Jesus knew from the beginning what Judas would do. Still, he chose him, loved him, and treated him with the same grace he offered to the other disciples. Judas walked alongside the Master, witnessed miracles, heard his words, and had every opportunity to choose a different path. But in the end, he was consumed by his own choices. His legacy, however, goes beyond being just a grim warning. The story of Judas is also a reflection on human fragility, on how choices can take us to places from which we cannot return. Redemption was within Judas's reach, as it is within everyone's reach, but he did not seek it. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson of his tragic trajectory, a story that, even marked by pain, invites us to reflect on the power of forgiveness, choice, and grace that is always offered to us. The first lesson we learn from Judas is about the power of choices. Even though he was so close to the truth, He chose the path of greed, selfishness, and ultimately hopelessness. His story teaches us that it is not enough to be close to grace. We must accept it and live it in a genuine way. Judas saw the truth, but he let his own expectations of who Jesus should be keep him from his divine purpose. Another important lesson is about repentance. Judas felt the weight of his betrayal, but instead of seeking forgiveness, he allowed himself to be consumed by guilt. In his despair, he did not realize that, like Peter, who also failed by denying Jesus, he could have found redemption. The story of Judas reminds us that repentance is always an open door, but it is up to us to walk through it. Finally, his life is a powerful reminder that the path of ambition and selfishness can lead to destruction, but still, the grace was there, waiting to be received. The story of Judas is tragic, but it invites us to reflect on our own choices and how willing we are to let ourselves be guided by the forgiveness and mercy that is always offered to us. If you like the story of Judas Iscariot and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible